Senhoras e senhores, sejam todos e todas muito bem-vindos a mais um episódio da nossa série especial Diálogos EQUILIBRIUM. Com vocês hoje temos o prazer de trazer o embaixador da República da Áustria no Brasil, Dr. Stefan Scholz. Dr. Scholz, vielen Dank.
Sehr gerne.
Vielen Dank. Hoje nós vamos falar um pouco sobre as relações bilaterais entre os nossos dois países, um pouco de política externa e um pouco também de cultura. Afinal, Equilibrium é um canal cultural. Este diálogo ele será filmado em inglês daqui para frente, tendo em vista que nós buscamos dessa forma alcançar uma audiência internacional mais ampla. Seguindo então, the name of our dialogue today is Austria and Brazil, from a Habsburg princess in the tropics to the Mercosul-UE agreement, 2 centuries of friendship and cooperation. So I would like to highlight that this dialogue is going to be available in our social networks, prioritarily here in our YouTube channel. So if you have not subscribed yet, please do it and ring the bell so you can receive our news every time that we do. And prior to actually starting it, it's more than fair to read our interviewee today's CV. So, Dr. Stefan Scholz. His Excellency Dr. Stefan Scholz was born on March 31st, 1966 in Vienna, the capital city of Austria. Dr. Scholz has an extensive academic and professional experience, highlighting the following. From 1988 to 89, at the University of Vienna, the Faculty of Human Sciences, Faculty of Law, Political Science, History and Law, with the master thesis, Austrian Politics Towards Eastern Europe. In the year of 1989, at the Stanford University in the Department of Political Science, the ambassador was a Fulbright scholar from May to December. In 1991, back to the University of Vienna, at the Political Science with the doctoral thesis, The Whole of U.S. Food Aid in the Austrian Politics After the First World War. From 1991 to 92, at the Johns Hopkins University, Paul H. Neitz School of Advanced International Studies, Bologna Center, studied international law and economics. And from 1993 to 1994, Institut Universitaire des Hautes Études Internationales, Genève, Security Policy, with a diploma. As a diplomat, he has been on missions to the United States, the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, China, and positions in the Austrian Ministry of European and International Affairs. He was ambassador to Nigeria from 2009 to 2012, to Iran from 2017 to 2021, and since 2021 has held the Austrian diplomatic mission to Brazil and Suriname. The ambassador is fluent in German, English, and French, and has knowledge and skills in Portuguese and Mandarin. So, starting our dialogue today, I just have one last message prior to passing the word to Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to always say that Equilibrium, as a think tank, has in its essence the plurality of thought. We are an independent political analysis company, and we always let people speak what they want, what they think. Precisely for this reason, the diálogos are a space for free speech where participants have the free right to express themselves, highlighting that the opinions of our interviewees are their own and do not necessarily represent the company's views. Mr. Ambassador, after this introduction, I begin by thanking you very much for having accepted our invitation today so that we can speak about these 2 centuries of friendship. I know that this partnership with Brazil is very important and that the world is changing really fast. And old boundaries are always really, I can say, not just important, but necessary in this changing scenario. So, the first question, it's more a space we have already introduced yourself, but always when we can, I like to address our participants and let you present yourself to the audience. Your biography has been explained, but whenever we can speak from ourselves, there is, as we say in Portuguese, sabor especial, a special flavor. So please, tell us about a little bit of your diplomatic journey.
Well, Professor, first of all, let me warmly thank you for the opportunity to meet today and also to talk to your listeners and to viewers. I've been in Brazil now for over 2 years, and these were very defining moments in my life. But on your question, why I picked this, the profession of a diplomat, on a very personal note, when as a 14-year-old I had my first stint in the United States, also at Stanford for the high school as a freshman. And during that time I had this incredible honor and opportunity to meet our Consul General in Los Angeles, a very kind man, a very cultured individual who told me about his outreach to the American public outside of the capital of Washington, about the huge diaspora of Austrians, about the many Austrians who escaped the Holocaust of Second World War and then settled in California, and to whom he also reached out and developed many cultural programs. So this idea was planted in my head, to be quite honest, as a 14-year-old. So I pursued it then, and also my studies at the university all were very much geared towards the idea of one day becoming a diplomat, which also requires to pass an entrance examination, which, just like in the case of Brazil, is something very demanding. It takes over a week, and so it was in no way a forgiven. But thankfully, I realized my dreams as a much younger man, and I became a diplomat in 1992.
Very good, very good. Thank you very much. When we start in the very interesting period, right? So these ideas, because when we look towards history, this gap, we're going to speak a lot of history today. So at exactly what happened back in 1938 with the Anschluss and this diaspora that you mentioned. So this new post-war Austria, it's a very interesting one, very good story. Now that our audience already knows a little more about you, Mr. Ambassador, let us talk about Austria and its relationship with Brazil. As mentioned in the start of this dialogue, it's not a recent one, 200 years and counting. Austria is an ancient country, but in its current form, the Republic of Austria, has existed since 1955. That is, we are talking about little less than 70 years, more or less about 3 generations. And many do not know that Austria, the first victim of Nazi Germany, as mentioned, like Germany, was also occupied by the Allied powers after World War II. Brazilians do know little about Austria, although we have had Habsburg princess as Empress Consort of Brazil. Furthermore, as we say in Portuguese, Dona Leopoldina was as or even more important than Pedro I and José Bonifácio in the process that culminated with the country's independence. In addition, there is a significant part of the population in Brazil that is of Austrian descent. Waves of immigrants came in the imperial entourage in the early 19th century, but also throughout the 1800s and 1900s. However, Austria is much more than part of history, and much more than beautiful mountains, beautiful landscape, waltz, and Mozart. Austria is an important player in Europe and the international scene. In foreign relations, Brazil and Austria are great partners, mutually supporting each other in matters of multilateral agenda. That said, can you talk a little more about Austria and its relationship with Brazil today?
Well, as an Austrian diplomat, it's of course a blessing to live and to work in Brazil, because we have such a strong narrative with Brazil, which is a peaceful one. We never waged war against each other, just the opposite. Our narrative is based on joint documentation and preservation of natural sciences, of flora, fauna, and anthropology. It was such a gift for me to find out that already in the 17th century, a great number of Austrian university professors came to Brazil. They founded a great number of cities, even in the Amazon basin, like the city of Tefe in the 1690s. And these were very well-educated individuals, university professors. Of course, in many instances, they came as Jesuit priests. But they published about Brazil's flora, fauna, and anthropology starting in the 1690s in Vienna, in Prague. And this was then continued during Donna Leopoldina's time. You remember when she came to Brazil in 1817, she brought along a scientific delegation, composed of scientists, of the so-called naturalistas, and they stayed in the country for more than 14 years, and they collected more than 110,000 artifacts. They are all exhibited today in the Vienna Museum for Natural Sciences and the Vienna Anthropological Collection. And it's the richest exhibition outside of Brazil. So you see, joint learning and knowledge management is really the core of Brazilian-Austrian relations. And to build a new relationship under today's circumstances on this beautiful narrative is really a gift from heaven. You mentioned before Maria Donna Leopoldina da Austria. She was one of the best educated women of her time in Vienna, because as a young girl already she studied at the Vienna University with the best professors in mineralogy and other fields of natural sciences. And she brought this knowledge to Brazil and tried to build this young country following independence to something that very much resembled the state of the art of science, scientific, social development, which ought to be inclusive. This is the Central European understanding. So during that time, a great lot of cooperation started between our two countries, some of which lasted until today. Just to tell you a lovely story, a few months ago I was invited by the University of Brasília for a condecoration ceremony. They wanted to decorate an Austrian scholar. I just shrugged when I found out that he had died in 1910 already. He was part of the delegation that was sent out to identify the future spot, the future location of the capital of Brasília between the late 1890s and 1910, a delegation composed of scholars from a number of European countries. The Austrian was the mineralogist.
In the cruise mission?
On the cruise mission, exactly. And he unfortunately fell ill here and died in the region of Brasília. But this country has such a collective memory. So 110 years later, I was invited by the university to receive the document that was issued in his honor, which I then sent back home. And this was also not easy, because of this imperial institution has long ceased to exist. So I had to identify the successor institution, to pass it on, and to ask also to inform the family in case that they were still to be identified and alive. So a science-based narrative, I think this is the core of our relationship on which I'm trying to build our new partnerships today.
Very good. Yeah, the continuing history, right? And it's good to see that we are a young country, and Austria a very ancient country, so rich history. But it's good to see that our paths, they crossed 200 years ago, and that men like you in this position, and our government as well, and society, because despite it being a public university, we're talking about a university which is society, are doing initiatives so that we can strengthen these relations even nowadays.
If you permit, I would just like to add one initiative. In 2022, you celebrated, of course, the Bicentenario in Brasília. And as a contribution by Austria, I organized together with Itamaraty, as the only European country, a symposium on the independence period. And we tried to shed light on the external perspective, which hitherto has been little looked at by Brazilian scholars. Yes. And we found out fascinating elements which are so important for today's young generation. To be proud, to know that this young country, even though only created in 1822 as a sovereign independent state, created such interest in Europe, in this case in Central Europe, in terms of its new socioeconomic development theories, its constitution of 1824, which was more progressive than those of the most progressive countries and powers in Europe. So it was intensively discussed in the political saloons of Vienna. Will this progressive constitution, will it create mayhem, or will it create inclusive development? it was much more advanced than the rights that were accorded to people in Austria during that time. So this was a matter of discussion. And secondly, once again, flora and fauna, which hugely fascinated home decoration, dresses, as well as the teaching curricula for biology classes in schools. So throughout the empire, which was the second largest at that time in Europe, from the 1820s on, children from Tyrol up to today's Western Ukraine learned in primary school about Brazil, about its rich flora and fauna. And Brazil had a nickname. It was called the fairyland. The fairyland about which young people dreamt of going there one day with its beautiful landscape, its pleasant people, and its rich culture and indigenous traditions.
Yes, I can imagine this, because the Austrian Empire then, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, was also very rich in so many different cultures, and imagining what was there overseas in that distant land must have been a really beautiful scenario back in the 19th century. Still.
We were closest during that time, I ought to say. Austria was the first amongst today's European Union member states, non-belligerent member states, to recognize the independence and sovereignty of Brazil in 1825. And for this very reason, ladies and gentlemen, we are focusing the Bicentenario celebrations not only on last year, 1822, but we continue until 2025. We call it the Ciclo da Independência do Brasil de 2022 a 2025. And all of our cultural programs and scientific programs are put into the context of this cycle of independence.
Yes, fantastic. Fantastic. Mr. Ambassador, now let's talk about geopolitics. Can't run of it. As a think tank, Equilibrium is always asked about Russia and Ukraine, for instance, and this is also in today's agenda. But before, I want to speak of the increasing importance of Austria in the European Union. Since you mentioned of the current European Union member states and in their relation with Brazil, I want to bring the Mercosul-EU agreement. First, let's contextualize. It is always important to put history in the game before we talk about the present time and what we intend for the future. Austria has been a member of the European Union since January 1995. A very active member, actually. The country is discreet in its activities, but due to the quality of its professionals and its strategic location in Central Europe, it stands out in all areas. Currently, it is even considered one of the last countries which, with its currently coalition between Christian Democrats and Green Party, where you can still see social democracy and the welfare state actually manifested in Europe. Despite the privatization of recent years, which are currently on pause, the country preserves its historical legacy from the times of the Great Empire, a strong social outlook, an active cultural life, and a mix of agriculture and industry that contributes to the GDP health, both nominal and per capita. We can say that pragmatism guides the country, internally and externally. Some observers attribute Austria's resistance to approving the agreement with Brazil to this, an agreement that, without going into details, as much more contextualization would be needed, in its current form does not benefit either South Americans or Europeans. So, Herr Doctor, being so, can you please talk a little bit about Austria's role in the European Union and the country's view on the agreement as it is today?
Gladly will do so, Professor. Austria joined, as you rightly say, in 1995, and this was not a forgiven. For many years there were discussions running in Austria whether we should and could join the European Union, because Austria is a neutral country based on its law on permanent neutrality of 1955. As you might know, historically, Austria was occupied between 1938 and 1955 for 17 years by foreign powers. During the first 7 years, when Austria was occupied by Nazi Germany, I should not hide the fact that even though so many Austrians perished, even in the first weeks only of the Anschluss, also a great number of Austrians collaborated with the invading forces and also committed atrocities, most regrettably in many places of the war theatre. Nevertheless, the political establishment, as we knew it, the center parties, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, from the first day on, they found themselves in jail, in most cases sitting next to each other, and they gave an oath during that time. It's the beautiful legend and narrative of Austria, post-war narrative. They gave an oath to each other, never again to confront each other, but to jointly build up Austria after the hopeful liberation one day, which happened in May 1945. And in the following years, these two parties that were at loggerheads during the First Republic, they developed a very highly developed system that we call the social partnership, where the Chamber of Commerce on the one side and on the other side the trade unions basically develop not only the economic legislation but also the social legislation of the country. So even before it touches the parliament for a vote, these two pillars of the Austrian social partnership have agreed, found a consensus, and in this way Austria became one of the most peaceful countries in the post-war period, with the least strike days in Europe or even worldwide, for the simple reason that both sides saw themselves sufficiently represented in this very special kind of political system. So when, following the end of the Cold War, the idea came up that Austria, together with the other neutral countries, Sweden and Finland, plus NATO country Norway, should join the European Union. During that time, there were many vested interests in Austria who were opposed to such a move, to be quite honest. And I'm telling this story all the time to Brazilian officials. Why were they opposed? Because there were many monopolies, oligopolies in Austria existing at that time, many vested interests, many fixed prices, that even though they created a kind of social peace, there was a kind of glass ceiling for further development of our economy. So it was with great relief when we learned that the referendum held in late 1994 turned out more than 68% positive in favor of joining the European Union. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, I should tell you, you had this country that was economically very closed. Maximum, there were some good trade contacts with Germany and some with northern Italy and Switzerland, but that was it. This country flourished. It started so much to flourish. Today, 6 out of 10 years of Austria's GDP are generated by the export sector. So we fully transformed our economy. We made them competitive. And in many cases, you will find Austrian products in small niches being even world market leaders. I'm very glad that a great number of them are here in Brazil. And of course, also here, they are the leaders within LATAM, the biggest producer in specialized steel, like the racks for photovoltaic plates, or be it special cranes, fibers, and number of other things, special switches for rails. They have full order books and are market leader within Latin America. And water turbines. We should talk perhaps a bit later then about the great energy transition and the transformation of our economy towards a green economy. Here, Austria and Brazil are two natural partners that are actually doomed to cooperate. We are depending on each other if we want to achieve these very ambitious targets. Coming now to the Mercosul-EU draft trade agreement. The negotiations lasted for nearly 30 years. 30 years ago, the first contacts in this respect were started. The current draft, as we know it, has here the Austrian Parliament has raised objections. So we have 2 motions in the National Council and 1 motion in the Federal Council, and also in the governmental program. This is mirrored. That Austria has certain apprehensions regarding the text as it stands, and therefore is looking with great anticipation towards the additional instrument, which supposedly will address these Austrian concerns. And we are not the only country here. There are a number of other European Union countries that see it very much the same way as Austria does. The deciding moment will be the final consensus draft of the additional instrument, which hopefully will sufficiently address also the Austrian concerns. We have a small agricultural economy. It's basically family-owned businesses who also provide great services to landscape gardening. This also plays in the hands of tourism, which makes Austria one of the most successful countries in terms of tourism. And our farmers gained certain exemptions from the European Union for organic farming. This was an item that was introduced by Austria many years ago into the European Union, which made us the delicatesse store of Europe. And this is something we want to maintain and to keep. And these elements we hope will be addressed sufficiently by the additional instrument, which right now, as we know, the draft has been circulated amongst Mercosur member states, and hopefully soon to be in the next few days or weeks be handed over to the European side, and then we will take a very, very close look at it and make our determination.
Good, interesting. And also considering that, well, at the current moment, Mercosur itself is changing a lot, right? So we have had an election in Brazil that changed its government, Argentina next month. So very good to see how it's going as well.
Well, indeed, when you ask me personally, I think this will be such a game changer for Latin America and Brazil, for Mercosur and Brazil itself, in terms of, just like Austria 30 years ago, help to swiftly modernize the economic administration of Brazil, introduce structural reforms, which would probably not so easily be introduced if it were not because of obligations towards this agreement. Just like Austria.
Yes.
I think these modernization drive the European Union brought, we would not have managed without the benevolent inspiration by the European Union.
And I thank you because of that, because this is actually the introduction for our next question. Skipping with Austria in Europe, but about EU itself today and these new ways that are opening. Actually bringing to the dialogue new trade routes. We say new, but actually are old trade routes that are being rediscovered, revisited, and talk about the current situation in Europe facing greater challenges. Austrian Empire was a gateway to the Adriatic, Italy, and both the Mediterranean and Asia trade routes. And from the Asian perspective, access to the Adriatic and markets in Central and Eastern Europe were geographically facilitated to trade. We can also talk from our market here, late 19th century, how a city that today is Italy, but it was Austrian Empire, Trieste, flourished due to being the European capital of coffee. Most of it came from Brazil. And Vienna being the beating heart of this Europe of the past. So with these new old trade routes beginning to reopen, we are speaking of passages that have been closed. We can go up to Mehmet taking over Constantinople in 1453. But with this rediscovery, even so in the context of a Chinese Belt and Road and the Silk Road that the European Union has started itself. We are talking about the meeting of past and future. On the top of all that, the European Union is no longer as innovative as it once was. The great moves of the giants of the past, like Julius Raab, Konrad Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, and Robert Schuman, are no longer seen. There are those, in a critic manner, that say that EU has stopped being innovative. The euro was the last big innovation and has become more reactive. when you mention that these changes in Austria, when it opened itself to Europe, made a great benefit to the country, and based on what we have already spoken about the political and economic situation in Austria, this Austrian way, is the Austrian way the model that European Union today needs?
Well, I definitely think a government as inclusive as possible can always only be a model.
Okay.
I would not exclude that there are similar comparable specificities also in other European Union countries. However, we are the only remaining neutral country. Just yesterday at the Brazil Defense Day, Secretary from the MOD mentioned that Austria's neutrality has many things in common with Brazilians' understanding of neutrality policy as exercised right now. So you see there are some specificities of Austria which we have to also bring into this European decision making, and we want to see it reflected there now also after Sweden and Finland decided to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. One of the greatest challenges of our time right now is the energy transition and the transformation towards a green economy. And I compare this very much with this experience that I mentioned before when Austria joined the European Union. There are many voices in Austria that are hesitant, that say we can simply not afford it. It will lead to a reduction of our prosperity and of our personal income. While there are others that embrace the change, this theory of change, and explain that this is a new lead sector that is opening up. As Austria and Europe are going ahead from many other parts of the world, this would create new technologies, new experiences that we can then share with the rest of the world. It should make our economy stronger, it should make our research institutions stronger, and it should also revive our old tradition of artisanship in terms of apprenticeships. When you look at the map of Europe, the highest productivity you will find is in Switzerland, South Germany, and west of Austria. And this is exactly this area which introduced in the late Middle Age the idea of dual education, of young people at the age of 15 working on the factory floor 2 to 3 days, and the remaining 2 days visit a specialized school. I know you have something broadly similar here, but the difference in Austria is that the kids from the age of 15 on learn to work. And they also earn a small salary, which gives them also independence. And the beauty of the system is, what do they learn during these 2 days at school? They learn how one day to become self-employed and to create their own company, how to do a tax declaration form, how to fill out all various requests and demands and seek approvals. This is meant to empower young people to become self-employed. And the backbone of our economy are small and medium-sized enterprises. And the same you have in Switzerland and in Germany. Also here, to be fair, Austrian Mittelstand, which is also the backbone of German prosperity, their companies are usually 10 times larger than Austria's. We are talking about 15 to 50 people, while the Germans talk about 50 to 500 people and still call it the medium-sized enterprises. But still, these are dynamic ones that go ahead with innovation, that adapt to new market conditions, and who are so eager to explore and to win new markets. And the war in Ukraine is another drive of change. As sad as it is, and we will talk later about it, Ukraine, the opening up of the Iron Curtain, when I was a boy, there was literally an Iron Curtain. You could not put one step into a neighboring country. Only when I was a young man in 1989, when the situation changed in Hungary and the Czech Republic, when our foreign ministers together tore down the Iron Curtain in one section between Austria and Hungary. And this created a completely new market for Austrian small and medium-sized enterprises, helping these countries to transform, to do structural reforms, to have modern banking systems. Here, Austria in many ways was the lead. So in many of the Central Eastern European countries, Austrian banks and insurance companies are often the number one or number two or number three. And this has helped our small businesses to enter these markets because their home bank was already present and their home insurance, which reassured them that they would find very similar conditions as back in Austria. And now the war in Ukraine is a sad reminder to us that we put too much of our kitties into one basket. For that very reason, I saw this already last year, companies, small, medium-sized companies from Austria coming and entering the Brazilian market. And when I asked them what the reasons, why do they come at this time, they told me it is because we have to diversify our risk. The risk that we currently face in Ukraine, in Russia, in Belarus, and also other places in Central Eastern Europe. So they try to diversify, so it means to rediscover Brazil. Brazil that was so close in the 1820s, 30s, 40s until 1900 more or less, it is being rediscovered by people who normally are not risk takers, but they're coming here for the yearly conference, Connect Austria, always held in October, around 24th of October this year again, where all the local Austrian subsidiaries meet and many more companies from Austria who have not yet entered the market. And just for your information, according to Brazilian statistics, Austrian companies created 20,000 well-paid industry jobs, 20,000 in Brazil. So indeed, we are also a stakeholder of the great transformation of Brazil and the objectives of the current government under the able leadership of President Lula.
Thank you. And if I made a comment, two interesting points here. The first one is the educational system, because in Brazil we always associate like young people's labor to child labor, which is one of the bad things of this country. But according to the statistics of the system S, that is like who capacitates people in Brazil to the whole areas from industry to trade and the agriculture as well, the greatest problem that more than 50% of companies are bankrupted before the first year is exactly because their owners do not know how to manage a business. Mm-hmm. One of these things that young people in Austria learn.
It's one of my great objectives in this country, and I've been talking to many politicians since Austrian companies gladly said we would love to introduce this system, but simply we are barred by law. So I've put this idea, this thought into a number of politicians here already to give a special permit for a pilot project. A pilot project somewhere in Paraná state where we have companies who are actually actively pursuing this idea also as their contributions to ESG and to inclusive social development in the country. We certainly respect the Brazilian legislation, which is very much the platinum standard also of international regulations and ILO conventions. But we, from our own judgment, can say enabling young people before they reach the age of 18 to become employed, to have their own self-earned pocket money, and to experience simply work under very clear and stringent rules, so that no exploitation can happen, and at the same time complement the complementary theoretical foundations, so that they also know how one day to create their own company, their own enterprises. And we have, by the way, we have more than 260 regulated professions in Austria, all regulated by the Chamber of Commerce. Teaching curricula, teaching materials, and the tests, this is all done by our economic chamber, which is based different to Brazil on law. So this makes them a state actor in every sense of the word, and they are responsible for all these courses in these 260 professions. So it's from the bricklayer to the carpenter, to the goldsmith and silversmith. all of these professions, the knowledge of the last 1,000 years, always the master passes on to the young apprentice.
Yes, and backbone of an economy. Yeah, and this is interesting when you bring this to Brazil, because it's actually the second point, that it's what we do. We explain Brazil to foreigners. Like I always like to say that many companies, they are born in Brazil with an inner look. We were born with an outside look. So exactly to call people and to show them how they can work in Brazil. And this is, at this very moment, it's intriguing because many of our clients, of the new ones, are mentioning that they are looking to Brazil, looking again, or for the first time looking from diversity of places in the world, because the world has become too small. But they need new markets. And here we have one.
And what they need is skilled labor, ladies and gentlemen. Skilled labor. We have the biggest shortage in Europe since 1945 of skilled labor, and also Brazil has this shortage. And how to address it, I have also a pilot project, if I may, very briefly.
Sure, please.
It is a triangular concept which is aimed at strengthening local training institutions and then hiring young people for a limited period to work in an Austrian company and then to come back with the knowledge and the necessary contacts and to build up their own company. We are trying this in Santa Catarina in the area of health nurses, hospital nurses. So I've had my first contacts with a medical university attached to which is a nursery school. We would provide our training curricula. We would help them to build it up to the standards that allow in Austria certification of this this profession, and then have a given number of people who would then work for some years in Austria and then come back to Brazil. So you have a triple win, as this concept is called. It's not this one-sided migration where people simply come here, other countries' representatives, and trying to attract your limited skilled labor and creating a hole then in your labor market. No, we try to have the triple benefit for all three parties involved.
Very good. So we need to talk now about hard geopolitics, since you have mentioned in your question Russia and Ukraine. Question that everybody does it. Basically, it's the question that not just our clients, but as we have a student wing as well, and an education department, many of our students are always asking it about. So our client reports there's always a comment about these disputes, and following what we have already mentioned about pragmatism, Austria has a very different perception regarding the impacts of the activities in Eastern Europe. We already have more than 500 days of military activity. Apart from the tragic humanitarian situation, we are talking about geopolitics. And geopolitics is about power and movements that impact the world, an arena where there are no innocent people despite the many victims. Regarding the situation of the conflict itself, both sides have lost a lot, but it is necessary to consider that despite sanctions against Russia, and anyone familiar with Russian military history know that colossal losses are for them part of the process, the economic situation is not negative. Recently we have had the data of the World Bank that Russia is now the largest European economy, has grown in the middle of all the sanctions. And as Churchill would say, that's the way it is. That's their style of fighting. Therefore, Mr. Ambassador, we would like to listen to your comment on two main points. The first one is, after this initial shock, did Europe already realize that Ukraine was the end of the paradigm that there is no more conflict in European soil? A parenthesis. This is a paradigm that the former members of Yugoslavia have interviewed the Croatian ambassador, and we spoke about this, that there is a perspective that in the Balkans, the war did not end in 1945, it ended in 2005. So is it, was the end of this paradigm? And the second, is Ukraine, to our time, what was Spain in the 1930s to World War II, maybe the prelude of something bigger?
Well, you rightly pointed out the Balkan Wars, and since Austria was a border country, we received huge refugee flows. The tanks, the Yugoslav tanks, were literally standing at the Austrian border and shooting at the Slovenian territory. We were really directly impacted, different to other European Union member states that are far away, and we were not yet an EU member state. So this also has to be said. It was much more dramatic than what we saw in 1968 when the Soviet Union entered Czechoslovakia. It was also during a hot summer of 1968, where all of a sudden we had to cope with realpolitik and realize that there's actually a war happening at our doorstep. So the difference, of course, to the Balkan Wars is that this time round it's a world superpower that is directly involved in the war effort, or is the party of the main party of the war effort that is happening. So you ask me if it can be compared with Spain. I mean, we hope and pray that this is not the case, and I honestly, on a personal note, I've lived through too many crises. At this point, I would definitely not see this as an imminent risk, though the contingency planning, of course, always have to be in place, that things can get out of control. But we do not see any reason at this very moment in time that this should happen, and that reason will prevail. We had this peace conference last week in Saudi Arabia, which gave us very much hope that many mediators, countries from across the world came together and are concretely working on a 10-point plan, trying to see if a consensus paper can be developed on this basis and then presented to the warring parties. So this is, aside of that, the European Union and the European External Action Service is most actively involved on behalf of the European Union member states. So we have full confidence and are completely loyal to this effort by our superiors back in Brussels, be it Mr. Borrell or the other commissioners who also have partial competence in addressing this issue. I should make a strong point. Austria is still a neutral country bound by the State Treaty of 1955. So Austria is not supporting directly the military effort. However, that means we are militarily neutral. What we are not is politically neutral. Here we are completely on the same line with the other European Union member states, and supporting in whatever way we can the response of the European Union in alleviating the humanitarian tragedy on the ground. So that is humanitarian help, secondly, of course, demining activities, and hosting a great number of Ukrainians in Austria. It is a bit of a different influx of people this time. It is mostly women, mothers with their children, whom we are sheltering, whom we are, to our best ability, trying to integrate into our school system and teach them German language, the mothers, so that also they can enter the labor market. We see great ambitions, and some anecdotes from teachers who told us that these young kids often no command of German, but they are, from the first day on, above the average age standards in fields like mathematics. So interesting to see this, and also a somber reminder that we have to keep reforming and improving our educational system.
Good. It's interesting, these neutral perspective facing what is seen these days, because this puts Austria in a, I don't want to use the word privilege, but it's the only one that I believe it works in this sense, as a mediator in future peace talks, as a neutral country with relations, good relations in the world. It could be some very strong.
For this very reason, we are very much interested, of course, in President Lula's peace initiative that is developing, complementary to all the efforts by the European Union, of course, but it is very clear we have to be open for every option and solution, wherever it would come from, in order to end this dreadful conflict and to bring back peace and development. And President Lula is very much engaged in this. He has assembled a number of countries with whom he's in close contact. Brazil is also talking to both sides, as does Austria. Our Chancellor talked to Putin and as well as to Zelensky, and not only once. So there are some common aspirations that, for me as an ambassador here, of course, are a great blessing, because it opens the room for jointly developing ideas. Whether they ever materialize or not is on a different plate, but there are cross-cutting interests that are becoming clearer by the day, on which I try to further develop our narrative, which is based on a cooperation policy approach. Cooperation policy approach, what can Austria bring to the table? It is certainly not big power politics, but what we can bring to the table is our experiences of, first of all, the State Treaty in 1955, which ended Allied occupation after 10 arduous years, arduous negotiations that went on with finally the Soviet Union and the Western powers agreeing to give back full sovereignty and territorial integrity to Austria and its government. Austria, after the last Allied soldiers left Austria, the next day declared by its own free will, it's very important, its permanent neutrality. So this can also, of course, become an element or not in future deliberations. And secondly, also very importantly, we had an important agreement reached with Italy in the late 1960s about the autonomy for South Tyrol. South Tyrol was a Austrian populated province that was ceded to Italy following the peace treaty of Saint-Germain that formally ended the First World War. And this agreement that we reached with Italy under the auspices of the UN gave maximum autonomy in terms of education, culture, use of Austrian language in public administration, and also to some degree in the area of taxation, which made Alto Adige one of the most affluent province of Italy today. We did not try to change the borders, but we tried to reach within a given situation the best possible solutions. Also, the South Tyrol package deal could serve as an example. And thirdly, what we can contribute is our experience in helping Central Eastern European state-owned, state-planned economies to transform to full market economies and to completely renew the public administration, bring it up to Western European standards. So many countries in Central Eastern Europe profited from this help, be it from the private sector or the public one. These twinning projects, for example, tax authorities, agricultural research institutions, across the board, Austria contributed hugely to this successful transformation of these economies, which today have higher GDP growth rates than the old European Union member states. So this is the third element, and I'm not only talking about Ukraine. The unfinished business of transforming the economy also, of course, affects Russia. Something that the Russian people had such great aspirations towards that, and to complete this transformation also of the economy in Russia. These are elements where we could, as a knowledge bearer, can bring something to the table. Once again, we are not a great power. We do not support the military effort, but there are these elements where we hopefully can contribute, and be it also to President Lula's peace initiative if more concrete points were to be made available.
Thank you very much, sir. And that's one of the things that in some talks that we have held, many have mentioned that solution for the crisis in Ukraine could be the Austrian solution. So, and we have come to the end of this episode, but the last question is not the question itself. It's always a moment where we let our interviewees leave a message or a comment that they want for our audience that has been listening to us so far here, and that are really interested in the relation between our two countries and in Austria today. So if you please, Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Dear listeners and viewers, thank you for sticking it out so long with me. Flora, fauna, anthropology. This is how it started, and that's where we stand today. And it's more important than ever. The energy transition in Europe and the transformation to a green economy. We cannot do without the green superpower, Brazil, for two very reasons. The CO2 footprint will probably be achieved in the public and private transport system. Where we cannot substitute it is in heavy industries. Our specialized steels, which in some small niches are world market leaders, they will continue to use two things which they can get from Brazil. One is credible carbon credits, and secondly, alternative fuels. When I talk about alternative fuels, I think about ammoniac/green hydrogen. I've visited a number of the federal states, 14 altogether, and I found that Ceará, but also places like Maranhão, have the best cost structure in the world to produce green hydrogen because of the affluence of water in Maranhão, which is not so much the case in Ceará, as we know, but the affluence in both of these federal states of plentiful of wind, 50% capacity utilization by wind turbines. In Europe, in Austria, we reach a maximum of 20%. So this is a great, great advantage to produce green hydrogen. It needs, of course, to be transformed into ammoniac because up to now we do not have the technology to ship green hydrogen to Europe. But there are already ideas to cooperate with places like the Port of Rotterdam to use the European pipeline system in order to dispatch green hydrogen from Brazil to Austria. So these are things that we are looking at right now. So these two elements should be once again the driving force. It is protecting the environment and creating a common future and social and inclusive development, both in Brazil and in Austria. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. Este foi mais um episódio dos Diálogos EQUILIBRIUM, hoje com o embaixador Dr. Stefan Scholz, embaixador da Áustria no Brasil. Ficamos por aqui. Não se esqueça de curtir, comentar e compartilhar e seguir a Equilíbrio nas redes sociais. Equilíbrio, os fatos e seus porquês. Thank you very much.
Thank you.